Hello again. Today we want to take a few minutes to talk about Plato's theory of forms, cornerstone of Plato's metaphysics. You've encountered this already several places in your readings for this week. It's in the Phaedo, Symposium, selections from the Republic, also perhaps indirectly in the dialogue called the Meno that you've been reading. In the Phaedo, it appears successively introduced bits and pieces interlaced with arguments about death. You may find that Plato talks about death a little bit differently than the way that Socrates talks about it in the Apology. And you may find in other dialogues that you have occasion to read that what Plato says about the soul or about death sound different again still from what we encounter in the Phaedo. This is one thing to keep in mind about Plato's form of writing and about the dialogue. Indeed, dialogue was an important form of philosophical exercise in the ancient world. Do keep in mind that philosophy in the ancient world was not some sort of an academic discipline taught by professors in tweed jackets at universities. It was understood as a particular way of life. The philosopher was someone who chose to live a particular form of life, and philosophic thought had consequences for how one decided to live one's life. In many ways, the figure of Socrates is taken as the paradigm for the philosophic form of life, though not all philosophers, of course, adopted the very same form of life. And a very important way of conducting philosophy was not by writing out set arguments in discourses or treatises, but actually by dialogue. And this is what's illustrated by Plato's dialogues. You notice that it's very difficult to pinpoint Plato as being committed to certain specific positions. Plato never says, "I'm Plato, and this is what I believe to be true, and these are the reasons why I believe this to be true." Plato always writes in the form of dialogue. He usually uses Socrates as the main interlocutor who leads the discussion in the dialogue. But the dialogue is very much shaped by the character and the opinions of the people with whom Socrates is talking. So different dialogues may reflect that. Different people are going to turn the conversation in different ways. Socrates is going to ask different questions depending upon what his interlocutors believe and think. Now, we saw in the Apology how Socrates dismissed fear of death as something that is the result of, that's foolish because it's the result of ignorance. It seems to presuppose that we know that it's something horrible, right, when in fact we don't know. In the Phaedo, we see a slightly different caricature of Socrates, but maybe not all that different. We see, as in the Apology and the Crito, a Socrates who is portrayed as being very much at ease with his impending death. The ones who are upset about Socrates' death are Simmias and Cebes, the main interlocutors of the dialogue, and presumably others who are present for the conversation as well. They think that this is something terrible unless Socrates can somehow prove that his soul will continue to exist with its own personal identity as Socrates' soul after his death. This is a view that doesn't appear to be shared by Socrates, and yet Socrates goes on and he engages them in developing a number of arguments about the immortality of the soul. Now, we're not going to spend too much time looking at those arguments, but do take a close look at them. You may not find that they are all persuasive as good arguments, and perhaps Plato didn't intend them to be either. That's a possibility. Remember, he's writing dialogue here. It's about the thinking and the exchange of ideas. Plato's never giving us any definitive conclusions and identifying those as his own. Now, these arguments about death are interlaced with his arguments about the theory of forms. Now I would like to look together with you at just two passages out of this fairly lengthy dialogue, the Phaedo, and see what he has to say about the forms, dissect these passages, and maybe this will clarify this concept of the forms, these ultimate realities that Plato's talking about, just a little bit more. The first passage is right around 65d, where Plato introduces the forms, or the character Socrates introduces the forms as something that is already familiar, evidently, to his audience. Notice what he says here. He says to Simmias, do we think there is such a thing as justice itself or not? And Simmias agrees. And beauty itself, and goodness itself. And he goes on to associate this with something that is accessible only to the soul, only to the mind. It's not accessible by the body. It's not something that you see or hear or taste or touch. It's something that you can know by the intellect. So what is this? This justice itself, the beauty itself, goodness itself. Well, we encounter another argument about that a little bit later on in the dialogue. At about 73e in the dialogue, Socrates begins talking about resemblances. This right after a passage that introduces the idea of recollection, uses it as a device for talking about the immortality, or at least the pre-existence of the soul, recollection which you encounter in the Meno as well. Indeed, the Phaedo makes a direct reference to the dialogue of the Meno. As to resemblances, recollection occasions this talk about resemblances, because when we recollect something, we see something, something reminds us of something that we have seen or become acquainted with at some other time. And Socrates notes that there are two forms. He does two ways in which things can be recalled to mind by something else. Some things that aren't present can be called to mind by something that is present. This can either be by association, right, such as if you see a musical instrument that belongs to your lover, then you're reminded of your lover by the musical instrument, even though there's no resemblance there. Right? The lover doesn't look like the musical instrument, but there's an association. But if you see a picture of your lover, that will also remind you of your lover. The picture will remind you for a different reason. That's because it's not particularly associated as an object with that person, but because the picture bears a resemblance to that person. And so here Socrates asks, well, notice this, right, about resemblance. We may be moved to ask ourselves whenever we see a resemblance, whether it's perfect resemblance or whether it's deficient in some way or other. Does the resemblance capture exactly? Is it indeed sort of a clone or a copy of the original? Or is it something that resembles it in some ways, but not in absolutely every way? Is it less than this? And now he's going to bring in an example that's perhaps a little bit confusing. And he talks about equality, or the equal. We won't go into all aspects of this particular argument, because there are some things that are fairly subtle and confusing and debated, particularly about when he's talking about equal as one thing or the equals as two things, because where there's equality, it's clear that there's a comparison going on. We're not going to worry too much about the subtleties in that for our purposes right now. But there's something that's fairly clear here. He talks about, we all understand equality, and he gives us a couple of examples, right? 2 sticks, we might say, are equal, or 2 stones, or something else, right? So how do we know that they are equal? How do we know to call them equal when we see them? Now here we're talking about something that we can, when we're talking about sticks and stones, we're talking about something that we are acquainted with. We don't need to be acquainted with just through the intellect. We have something that we have access to through the body, things that we can see or feel or lift and hold and check in that way. And so Socrates says what might be the most obvious answer. Well, how do we know these two sticks are equal? And the answer is, well, we look at them and we see them and we see they're equal. But to this, Socrates raises another question. Well, are there any two equal things that might not also look unequal to somebody else, or that might look equal from one vantage point but unequal from a different vantage point, or equal in one respect but unequal in some other respect? For example, maybe those two sticks are equal in length but not in width. Maybe the two stones are equal in weight but not in shape or size, or something else. So what he's saying here is that while we can recognize equality, what we can see just with the senses can be perceived as equal or as unequal. So this is Socrates' way of trying to say that, well, in fact, we cannot derive it just out of what we perceive by the bodily senses. We have to have an understanding of equality as such, an intellectual understanding, prior to being able to identify that when we see something that can be looked at as equal with the eyes. Precisely because anything that can be looked at as equal can also be looked at as unequal. It could be an example just as well for the opposite. Now, this may seem a confusing argument. We're going to talk in the future still about some of the passages in the Republic that you're reading, and we see a similar argument, another version of the same argument being made there again. It's going to refine this, and maybe it will clarify it a little bit further for you. But note basically what Plato is saying here, what he has Socrates say here, is that there are things that we can understand, okay, that we know, things that are intrinsic to the nature of things, like this property of equality, this kind of mathematical property. This is part of the fabric of reality and something that we can understand, but he's saying we cannot explain our understanding of it simply out of the phenomena that we can perceive through the senses. We must have access to it from somewhere else in order to be able to perceive that through the senses. This is something that we know by the intellect somehow, not by the senses. And this is what Plato calls here a form. And what he asserts is the fundamental sort of reality.